Hello there and welcome to another video. This video is once again based on a book, and if you've seen any of my previous video you might recognize this one. This video is based on Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, which I highly recommend. What I wanted to talk about today is not really a trendy topic, but when I was reading about this I thought it was very interesting. And I think that this stuff that I'm gonna start talking about helps us a bit to step out of our own viewpoint and gives us a bit of a different perspective on humankind and humanity that is not really taught to us in the school. In short, I'm going to try and break down and maybe even convince why the agricultural revolution, which is the reason why we have everything that is around us today, might actually have been a scam for us humans as a species, and how it tricked us into going down this road as a species. However, first we're going to have to go through some of the basics about what life looked like for the prehistoric humans and how agriculture got started. So for 2.5 million years we were basically wandering around, just feeding ourselves by gathering plants and hunting animals that were naturally living around us. Also, the other species of humans, such as the Homo erectus, for example, or the Neanderthals, were also feeding themselves by foraging plants and foraging whatever they can find, and maybe occasionally they would hunt down a wild sheep or something. But generally, we were feeding ourselves by what was naturally occurring around us. The animals, they bred naturally in the wild, and the apple trees or the fig trees, they occurred wherever they occurred without us humans having planted them. Now, clearly a lot has changed since then. As you probably know, us humans, we originated from the region of East Africa, and from there we expanded all the way to the Middle East and to Europe and to Asia. Eventually we even reached the Americas and also to Australia, but we were still living off of the wild plants and hunting the wild animals that were naturally living around us. And it's kind of hard to imagine why we would ever want to do anything else. I mean, this way of life provided us with enough calories and enough nutrition so that we could build our social structures. We had enough time and energy to develop religious beliefs and rituals. And it even gave us enough free time to pursue things like art and music. This way of life even allowed us to expand all over the globe, which is not true for many species. And it's what we had been doing for thousands of years, so it's a bit odd why all of a sudden we decide to switch it up and change our lifestyle completely. Nonetheless, around 10,000 years ago we suddenly decided we're gonna dedicate most of our time and most of our lives to manipulating just a few particular animal species and a few particular plant species. In other words, we started to farm. Basically, from dusk till dawn, we now had to sow seeds, we had to water, we had to pluck weeds, and we had to lead animals such as sheep through different pastures, for example. People thought that this would provide them with more food and perhaps even a more pleasant way of life. For our humans, this meant it was a kind of revolution in terms of how we were living our life. Agriculture first appeared around the region that is today southeast Turkey and western Iran, and it started off around 9000 BC. The first to be domesticated was the goat and wheat at around 9000 BC, and these were then followed by peas and lentils at around 8000 BC. And this kind of kept on going step by step. We were domesticating more and more plants and animals all the way until 3000 BC. This was kind of our first wave of domestication. Horses, for example, they were domesticated at around 4000 BC, and interestingly enough, no new significant animal has really been domesticated since then, or since the last 2000 years. Still to this day, with all the new technologies and whatnot, more than 90% of our calories still come from the same plants and animals that our ancient ancestors domesticated between the period of 9000 BC and 3000 BC. The base of our cuisine is basically that of ancient farmers. Funnily enough, people started doing this in different corners of the earth more or less at the same time and without being aware of each other. So as people in the Middle East were cultivating peas and lentils, they did this completely independently and without knowing anything about people in South America that were cultivating potatoes and llamas instead. However, some regions of the earth were left without any agriculture, regions like South Africa, Alaska, and even Australia. And the reason for this is kind of simple, actually. Not all species are suitable for domestication. Just because you were hunting mammoths doesn't mean that you would be able to domesticate any mammoths. They are way too fierce and way too strong for that. So the few species that were suitable for domestication, they lived in certain places, and these places are also the ones that correspond to where the agricultural revolution occurred. Contrary to what we like to believe, hunter-gatherers actually had a more varied and a more healthy diet than their supposedly more advanced farming descendants. In most cases, the foraging actually provided the ideal nutrition. And of course, this would be the ideal diet. It's the diet that us humans had had for hundreds of thousands of years. So of course, we had become adapted to this diet. In fact, when we look at fossilized skeletons from hunter-gatherers, we can see that they were much less likely to suffer from starvation and malnutrition. They were also more taller, and they were also overall healthier than their farming descendants. And this kind of goes a bit against the common idea that farming was the inevitable way of progress for us humans. And now you might think is a good time to bring up the average life expectancy of the hunter-gatherers as a kind of counter-argument against their lifestyle, because their average life expectancy was only 35 years of age. So how can I sit here and kind of claim that they were so healthy? Well, basically, this average life expectancy is very misleading. It's only brought down by the child mortality rate, and so if a child managed to make it through the first dangerous years of their life, then they were pretty likely to make it all the way until 60 years of age, and some even made it to 80 years of age. And what protected these foragers over the farmers was their diet in particular, that was very healthy and it was very varied. In contrast to the foragers, during our pre-modern agriculture times, if times were rough, almost all of your calories would be coming from just one type of crop, like wheat or potatoes, for example. And by being so heavily dependent on a single type of plant or a single type of crop, it became extremely easy to miss out on essential nutrients like vitamins or minerals. This also meant that if that one food source failed because of a drought, because of a fire, because of a random beetle or whatever, then you would simply die of starvation. The very diets of the foragers, on the other hand, with maybe frogs and mushrooms one day, and the next day some snails, root, and maybe a rabbit, that kind of diet was much more likely to provide you with the essential nutrients that you need. And of course, hunter-gatherers and foragers, of course, also suffered from starvation during rough times or because of natural disasters or whatever, but they were more resilient in the face of these sort of calamities. They could more easily switch to depend on other species, and they could more easily just move and relocate. The ancient foragers also suffered much less from diseases, because most of the diseases throughout our human history have come from living too close with domesticated animals. And these types of diseases, they first really started to appear with the agricultural revolution. Since the foragers didn't live close to any domesticated animals, except the trusted dog, of course, they were not as susceptible to suffer any disease epidemics. And on top of the risky proximity that the farmers had with their domesticated animals, they also had a risky proximity to each other. They were living much more closer together, and they were living under less hygienic conditions as well. The foragers in their bands that were constantly roaming around, they were simply not able to sustain any epidemics contrary to the farming societies. Now, scholars used to believe that the agricultural revolution was a kind of result of more intelligent humans that had finally progressed into decoding nature, and they were using this to their own advantage, and that this was the agricultural revolution was the inevitable progress of us humans from a more primitive and less sophisticated way of life to the more sophisticated way of life that is the agricultural society. However, the author of this book explains that this is a fairy tale and this is not the case. There is zero indication that people became more smart as they became farmers, and the foragers knew the secrets of nature much better and long before any farmers came along. They depended way more of nature and of the knowledge of nature because it was key for their survival and they were in tune with it. The new lifestyle of farming, sadly, instead of improving living conditions, made them worse and made life more difficult, and also made the life less satisfying than the life of the ancient foragers and the hunter-gatherers. We tend to think, and we like to think, that it's the opposite because our own luxurious and comfortable and very sophisticated lives is built on the backs of the ancient farmers. But if you compare the ancient farmers and the ancient foragers, the foragers were much better off. They were in less danger of disease and famine, while at the same time having to work less hours in the day compared to the ancient farmers. The farmers worked harder and yet they got less in return. Although agriculture increased the overall food supply for all of mankind around the globe, it also led to more misery and it led to privileged elites for the first time as well. But so, who can we say is kind of at fault for this or for initiating this agricultural revolution? Well, in short, you could say the culprits are a handful of plant species, because in a way, they were the ones that started off by domesticating us. And this is also the perspective that the author takes in this book, and I thought it was an interesting way to look at it, because we always like to think of ourselves or of humans as the main characters in nature and that all the changes are originating from us. And I know we don't really attempt or we don't mean to think like that, but we just do, and we forget that we're also just another organism. We're also just another animal that is living for the first time on this earth, and although we have been domesticating other species, we're also just another species that could be domesticated themselves. Think of it like this. This wheat plant was basically just chilling in the corner in the Middle East, and then this omnivorous ape, Homo sapiens, came along and discovered it. And now, wheat grows in unimaginable quantities all around the globe just because we discovered it. And the evolutionary criteria for success is basically just how much of you can reproduce and how much of you that there is around. And with these criteria in mind, you could say that wheat has knocked it out of the park. Wheat could be considered the most successful plant species in the history of our planet. There are around 2.25 million square kilometers of Earth's surface that is covered by just wheat and nothing else. That's like 10 times the size of Great Britain. And just imagine the Great Plains of North America. They had like never seen a single straw of wheat until a few thousand years ago. And now there is like hundreds of kilometers where nothing except wheat is growing. And this random ape, Homo sapiens, us humans, we used to roam around pretty freely and living pretty comfortable until about 10,000 years ago. And then all of a sudden we started to put more and more effort into taking care of this wheat. And not far after that, we were doing basically nothing else except taking care of this wheat. And the wheat, it asked a lot from us. The wheat doesn't like to share the space with rocks or with other plants. So what did the humans do? Well, we started breaking our backs, emptying fields of rocks so that the wheat could grow in peace. We started weeding out other plant species so that the wheat could grow in peace. If the wheat got thirsty, we had to carry water and water it and dig irrigation canals. And sometimes we even had to feed the wheat to keep it from starving by giving it animal feces so that it has all the nutrients to live happily ever after and grow as much as it likes. We basically did everything that the wheat asked from us. And this way of life, taking care of wheat, is not what we had been evolved to do. We had evolved to be foragers and to live with nature as it is around us. We evolved to climb trees for fruit or trap squirrels or run after some antelopes. But we had not evolved to empty fields of rocks or breaking our backs digging irrigation canals under the scorching sun. And because of that, our bodies also, they paid the price. When investigating fossilized skeletons or skeletons from ancient farmers, we can still diagnose things like arthritis and slipped disc, which was very common among these farmers. Secondly, because this agricultural lifestyle required so much time, we were also forced to settle down permanently. Agriculture did not allow us to move around and roam anymore. And so if you look at the word domesticate, it comes from the Latin word domus, which means house. And to quote the author from the book, who's the one living in a house? It's not the wheat, that's for sure. It's the humans. It's the humans that were forced to move into houses. It's the humans that were domesticated by the wheat. We were put into permanent settlements after having roamed around in nature for thousands of years. Now, the real question is, how did the wheat manage to make the humans agree to this deal? What was in it for the humans, and what did we actually get in return? For sure, the diet was not an improvement, since a human is basically an omnivorous ape, and grains and cereals are only supposed to be a very tiny part of our diet. We thrive on a wide variety of foods, and cereals is poor in vitamins and minerals, and on top of that, it takes a lot of energy from us just to digest it. And if that wasn't enough, it's also pretty bad for our gums, actually. Neither did it give us any kind of advantage in terms of economical security. A hunter-gatherer was much better off security-wise than a farmer. And this is along the same lines as what I mentioned earlier, that by relying on just a very small amount of plant species, or maybe just a single amount of plant species like a wheat or potato, the farmers were extremely susceptible to disasters or to natural occurrences, like if it was too much rain, if it was too little rain, if a fungus arrived and killed your crops. If any of these things happened to you, then you would be dying. And when this happened, and it happened many times in human history, thousands of people died all at once, and sometimes even millions, just because of the weather. The wheat did not even manage to protect humans from other humans. The early farming societies were at least just as violent, and most likely even more violent than the ancient hunter-gatherer societies. And of course there would be more violence, because if you think about it, these ancient farmers, they actually kept a lot more material possessions that they had to protect, and they had private properties that their livelihood depended on. The hunter-gatherers, on the other hand, basically didn't have, they had possessions, but not a lot of possessions at all. And they didn't have any private property that they had to protect with their lives. If there was a conflict, for example, the farmers had almost no room for compromise because they were stuck where they are. A forager, they could simply pick up and move on and set up camp elsewhere. But for a farmer, this was not an option. Retreat as a farmer meant giving up land. It meant giving up your crops, your houses. Basically, if you retreated as a farming society, it meant you were doomed for starvation. So farmers were much more likely to, they had to stay put and fight to the end in order to have any chance of surviving in a conflict. Among these ancient farming societies, the level of violence or the mortality due to violence has been estimated to be 25% among males and 15% overall. Just imagine if the murder rate in your city was 25% for males and 15% overall. That's a ridiculously high percentage of violence and deaths because of this violence. And in the book, the author brings up many different ancient farming societies or agricultural societies and their level of violence. And I remember one of them was in Ecuador for the Vaurunis or something like that agricultural society, where 50% of the deaths were at the hand of an were at the hand of another human. That's a ridiculously high percentage, 50%. Eventually, we managed to get this crazy level of human violence a bit under control by building these large social frameworks such as cities and kingdoms, etc. But even these big social frameworks, they were still extremely violent, and they took thousands of years to get right or to even get them working somewhat. Those political structures then also had to be maintained, and even then wars could break out on a scale that our human species had never seen before. Of course, the village life of an ancient farmer also had some advantages. It wasn't all doom and gloom. Like, for example, it gave you more shelter from the weather, for example, and maybe there was less chance that you were going to get eaten by a leopard or something. But the disadvantages clearly outweighed the advantages for these ancient societies. And when you compare them to their foraging ancestors, I think they would also agree that their foraging ancestors were better off than the ancient farmers. We don't like to hear this stuff because our own luxury is thanks to the earlier humans taking the path of agriculture. And most of us love the progress that we have made to this point with having antibiotics and MRI machines and whatnot. And all the security and pleasures that we enjoy today is all thanks to and built on the backs of these ancient agriculture societies. But judging thousands of years of human history just from our own perspective or based on the luxury that we get to enjoy, it's a bit wrong as a way to go about it. Instead, a more correct perspective would be that of a poor farmer boy in the 1st century who is dying of malnutrition because his family's crops failed for 1 out of 100 reasons. And this dying boy in the 1st century would probably not say, "Oh, I'm dying of malnutrition, but it's all good because in 2000 years some people will get to live in air-conditioned apartment complex and get to order fast food from Uber Eats. So my suffering and my siblings' suffering and my parents' suffering is totally gonna be worth it." Obviously, such a child would have preferred the things to be in a different way. And in short, we can say that farming came with many disadvantages if we talk about the general experience of the humans that were living during this time. But so what the hell did agriculture actually provide, and how come it managed to push out this more favorable way of life that was hunter-gathering? Naturally, it seems weird and unlikely for us how a worse way of life could possibly become the more predominant one. But the reason for this is actually not that complicated. What farming did was that it provided more food per area. So basically, by replacing all the wild plants with wheat fields, the same area that could have supported 100 rather happy hunter-gatherers could now support about 1,000 unhappy, miserable farmers that were more likely to suffer from malnourishment and disease. And the evolutionary currency, or the success of a species, is not measured in how happy or how miserable they are. It only cares about the amount of the species. Those that can support themselves at a higher number over time will always beat out the smaller number through simple rate of reproduction. In the book, the author compares this to the success of a company. The success of a company is not depending on how happy the workers are. The success of a company is only dependent on how much money it makes. A company full of unhappy workers, but that is making a ton of money, is more successful than a company that is making zero money, but is full of happy workers. Because the second company will go out of business and cease to exist. The more DNA copies a species has, the more successful it is in evolutionary terms. And this is completely independent on the happiness or the misery of the species. And so from this perspective, 1,000 unhappy farmers that are miserable will always be more successful than 100 happy hunter-gatherers. Their respective misery doesn't influence the success of the species. And this was the recipe for success of the agricultural revolution. By keeping more people alive per area, but under worse conditions, it managed to eventually take over the planet. And in a way, you could also say that us as a humanity didn't actively agree to this arrangement, or at least not knowingly. It kind of just happened to us. We were baited into it by certain species such as wheat and goat, and before humanity knew it, we were deep into this farming lifestyle, and eventually we beat out the more favorable lifestyle of foraging. Agriculture was in a way a trap based on a false promise of a better lifestyle. Thank God that now 10,000 years down the line, however, we managed to turn it into something rather incredible. And we've come out the other end better than before. And we have the many technological and medical and social advancements to really thank for that. Like to really thank for that we're still not in the predicament of our farming ancestors. Anyway, that was all for me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if not, I'm sorry about that. But maybe you found it interesting to see the perspective that maybe a wheat plant domesticated all of humankind. And also, if you found it interesting, you can always buy and read this book. I highly recommend it. And everything I talk about I got from here. I just try to transmit some of the interesting things that I managed to get out of it. And I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, that was all. Thank you so much for your attention and for watching. And until next time, bye.